matter of public importance be submitted to the House for discussion, namely the need for secure jobs and secure pay. I call upon all those honourable members who approve of the proposed discussion to rise in their places, and I call the Leader of the Opposition.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Mr Speaker. This week we have seen the competing priorities of Labor and the Coalition on full display. A coalition obsessed with politics, a coalition obsessed with looking after its mates, and a Labor Party that is on the side of the Australian people. We have raised issues which will impact every Australian worker. The cuts to JobKeeper, the cuts to JobSeeker, the cuts to wages, the cuts to superannuation. Labor is focused on ensuring that we don't just try to fix some of the things that have been destroyed by the pandemic, but how do we emerge stronger, more secure? How do we deal with the fact that, just as the pandemic has shown the strength of Australian society and Australian values, as Australians have looked after each other, looked after their neighbours, looked after their communities and looked after people they've never met and will never meet, with the fact that, in terms of the government, they continue to just look after their mates. And just as we've seen that strength in our society, we've seen some of the weaknesses in our economy that are there. The fact that vulnerable workers were the first put off. The whole segments missed out on any support. The facts, like the people in aged care, who, as a proportion of the fatalities that have occurred during the pandemic, our figures are the worst in the world. 75% of those who've lost their lives are aged care residents, worse than anywhere else in the world. And this government is in charge of aged care. But of course we've seen this week they walk away from their responsibility. And today they walked away from their responsibility in their own legislation. We asked very specific questions about the clauses that are there to get rid of the Better Off Overall test. Guess what? If you get rid of and suspend the fact that workers have to be better off overall, what do you think's going to happen? What do you think's going to happen? What's the whole objective there? But of course, the minister stood up and pretended that the clauses that are there across the full page in the legislation aren't there. He said, "Oh, it just says insert," and then didn't read all the clauses that are there, which include, of course, that any business can say if it was impacted by COVID-19, then it can benefit from these provisions. Guess what? Every business has been impacted by COVID-19. Every citizen in the world has been impacted by COVID-19. But they can't even lie straight over there. Disingenuous, duplicitous, devious. That's what characterises them. They're not economic managers, they're just economic with the truth. Well, we on this side are on the side of Australian workers when it comes to job security. We will be saying to the Australian people, we're on your side when it comes to dealing with rising inequality. We're on your side when it comes to dealing with childcare costs. We're on your side when it comes to dealing with opportunity. We're on your side when it comes to dealing with the challenge of climate change. Those opposite are led by a man who's characterised by his avoiding of responsibility. He's not on the side of Australians when it gets tough. He goes missing in action. He went missing during the bushfires, and remember that quote, "I don't hold a hose, mate." That's what he said. The same approach that he's had to the pandemic when it comes to things that he is specifically responsible for, such as aged care, our international borders, where 40,000 Australians remain stranded overseas in spite of the fact they were promised they'd be home by Christmas. On aged care, they still don't have a plan. The Aged Care Royal Commission says that. He's not on Australian side when it comes to the costs of living. Childcare costs are due to increase this year by 4%, under the very design that the Prime Minister, when he was in charge of that area, designed the system. And of course we know that working Australians are particularly in the gun. And they speak about things like casual employment. Well, someone who wants to make themselves a permanent employee can't go to the Fair Work Commission. They have to go to the federal court. So you can imagine it, can't you? Your casual employee out there trying to classified as casual, being in an irregular job due to the very nature of it, thinking, I'll go lawyer up and go down to the federal court. I mean, these people are so out of touch. But of course, with their wage cuts, they want to hit you in the present. With their war on super, they want to hit you in the future. And we know from the former Finance Minister, Matthias Cormann, who says low wages growth is a deliberate feature of our economic architecture. And you compare their attitude and whose side they're on over their attitude towards former Finance Minister who's after a job overseas. We hope he gets it. We back Australians on this side. But flying around Europe in a RAF jet
40,000 stranded.
with 40,000 Australians who can't get home. They say they care about Australian jobs. 90,000 jobs in manufacturing have disappeared on their watch. 90,000. They dared the car industry to leave, dared it to leave. And when you look at whose side they're on, something that this Prime Minister used to talk about, just have a look at the difference between the way they deal with vulnerable Australians, hit up for robo-debts, where they have had to pay $1.2 billion back. If you overestimated how much Centrelink should pay you, you got letters threatening you with jail. You got followed up. And the fact is that compare that
Members on my left
with JobKeeper. Compare that. If you're a business that overestimated the drop in your income and your profits went up, guess what happens? You can keep the money, you can pocket it, and you can give it as bonuses to the executives. In other parts of the world, this doesn't happen. Robo-debt or similar things have happened overseas. The Dutch government has just resigned recently over this scandal. We had the Reserve Bank yesterday spoke about JobSeeker and how we should lift it beyond $40 a day, and they said it was a matter of fairness. What did they do? They sent out Freedom Boy to attack the Reserve Bank, and said, "Oh, that wasn't their responsibility." The fact is, what we see from their side is consistently looking after their mates. Sports Rorts, Paladin contract, $78 million to Webster Limited, more than double the valuation for buying up water. What we see is the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, $444 million. Lepington Triangle, $30 million. Hello World that we saw today. Hello World out there that we saw today. That scandal. We see funding given to the Liberal Party's pollsters to do research that they then hide from the Australian people. Private research. We see trillion-dollar debt with no legacy from it. We see a whole lot of announcements but very little delivery. It is all smirk and mirrors from those opposite, Mr Speaker. What we need in Australia is a government as good as the Australian people themselves. A government that is truly on the side of working people, that's on the side of families who are dealing with the costs of childcare, that's on the side of Australian communities that need appropriate infrastructure and investment, that's on the side of Australians who want to lift their standard of living. The alternative that we'll be presenting in the lead-up to the next election will be doing just that. We'll be saying that Australia needs a government that is on your side, not a government that's on its own side.